Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our first virtual Historians Committee annual program, Centennial of the 19th Amendment, Why Doubling the Size of the Electorate to Include Women Mattered. We are so fortunate to be hearing from our distinguished panel, moderated by Judge Morgan Christen of the United States Court of Appeals, Ninth Circuit. I'm Lori Brownlee, Seeley Director for the Alaska Bar Association. Before we get started, I wanted to go over a few logistics. In just a moment, I will turn the program over to Historians Committee Chair Marilyn May, who will introduce Judge Christen. All participants' lines will be muted throughout the presentation. You can submit questions throughout the program, which will be emailed directly to Judge Christen and answered at the end of the presentation. Also, you will find biographies of all the speakers in your materials, which you can access by clicking on the blue Handouts tab just below the program title on your member dashboard. I will now turn the program over to Marilyn May. Thank you so much for participating.
Hello, and thank you for attending. I was pleased to hear this morning that we had 135 people registered, so I think that's a great start for our first webinar. The Historian Committee's purpose is to present programs and to preserve the history of the Alaska Bar. And I would like to tell you all about that, but we need to get to the program. So let me just tell you that you should take a look at our brand new webpage. You can navigate to it by going to the Alaska Bar Association website and clicking on the committee's link and go to Bar Historians. And there's a lot of information on there and fun and interesting stuff, and it'll be updated. So check every now and then. I think you'll find fun and interesting things. In a few minutes, we're going to have a video introduction from Senator Lisa Murkowski, and we want to really thank her for taking the time to do that. It's a lovely video. After that, our moderator, Judge Morgan Christen, will take over. But before I introduce the moderator, I want to thank a few people. First, thanks to the subcommittee who developed this program. The full Historians Committee decided that we wanted to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. The subcommittee, which consisted of Sheila Gallagher, John Havelock, retired Judge Peter Mahalski, and myself, decided that we wanted to focus more on the sort of consequences that followed from that. I want to thank Suzanne DiPietro of the Judicial Council and Sue Sheriff of the League of Women Voters for providing statistical information that you can find in your course materials. And of course, especially thanks so much to the panelists and to Judge Christen, who gave so generously of their time and expertise and passion in developing this presentation today. I also finally want to thank Judge Christen's judicial assistant, Sonia Belo, who really spent a lot of time helping to pull this together, and I think we probably couldn't have done it without her. So let me introduce our distinguished moderator, Judge Morgan Christen. Again, I'll give just a brief introduction. You can read the full thing in the biography online or in your course materials. Judge Christen was born and raised in Washington State. She got her BA from the University of Washington and her JD from Golden Gate University. She came to Alaska to clerk for Judge Brian Shortell and then worked in private practice with Preston, Gates, and Ellis before going to the Superior Court. And I first met Judge Christen when she was the presiding judge of the 3rd Judicial District, and I was the clerk of the appellate courts, and we sat on some committees together, and I got to know what a warm and wonderful person she is. Then I was thrilled when she was named to the Alaska Supreme Court in 2009, and we got to work more closely together. That was a fun time, but way too short, because in 2012, we were proud and pleased for her when she was appointed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, but kind of sad for ourselves because that was too soon. She has participated in a number of presentations and contributed to publications about women's suffrage. So she is the perfect person to lead this effort today. And again, we thank her, and we will turn this over to her right after this brief message from Senator Murkowski.
This year marks the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to our Constitution. But the fight for women's suffrage goes back much farther than that. It was at the historic Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 that the idea really started to gain popular support. And then in 1878, a suffrage proposal was introduced to Congress, but it was rejected. Now, obviously, Alaska was not a state in 1920, so we could not vote on ratification. But as a territory, we did pass a law granting women voting rights back in 1913. I think it is important to note, however, that Alaska Natives were not considered American citizens at the time, and they were excluded from the scope of the law. Many other women were similarly excluded from the vote. Black women may have been technically enfranchised by the amendment, but until, and even after, in many circumstances, the passage of the Civil and Voting Rights Act, their access to the ballot was incredibly limited. Now, why did this matter, as the title of this CLE says? It matters because this country was founded on ideals that weren't being fully realized by each of its citizens. The 15th Amendment, passed in the wake of the Civil War, forbade denying or abridging the right to vote based on race, but women were still left out. Now, to be somewhat cliche about it, this was a step on the road of forming a more perfect union. I wouldn't be in front of you today speaking as a United States Senator if women were still forbidden to vote. Our country would be in a radically different place in the absence of this right. Since 1980, women have voted at a higher rate than men in every presidential election. And since 1964, the total number of women voting has exceeded the number of men voting. Simply put, how women vote controls the outcome of every election these days. A better representation of the interests of every citizen of our country happens because of the 19th Amendment, and that's why it matters.
Thanks very much. And thank you for that kind introduction, Marilyn. I appreciate it very much. I'm Morgan Kristen, as Marilyn explained, and I want to, if I do nothing else, join her in thanking my judicial assistant, Sonia Belo, for all of her hard work on this program and on so many programs like this that I've done in the last couple of years. It's great to be here, and I appreciate the invitation to participate on this panel. I was asked to just do very quick introductions of our panel members because our materials are in your, their bios are in your materials. We have Elizabeth Hensley joining us. She is a partner from Landy, Bennett, and Blumstein. Jane Anvik, who many of you know, she was a member of the Anchorage Charter Commission. She's a former member of the Anchorage Assembly, former chair of the Anchorage Assembly, and a member of the Alaska Women's Hall of Fame. Renee Wardlaw, Senior Director of Corporate Compliance and Associate General Counsel for Bristol Bay Native Corporation, is on our panel. Elizabeth Hodis, a partner at Davis Wright and Tremaine, and also the current president of the Anchorage Association of Women Lawyers. And finally, we'll hear from Professor Kimberly Pace, who's a professor of political science at UAA and coordinator of the UAA Women's Studies program. My assignment is to give the group a quick overview, a backdrop of the history leading up to the suffrage campaign in Alaska. But I'm going to make it as quick as I can. For the past few years, I've been working on the circuit's outreach efforts around the Centennial, including participating in the Ninth Circuit Historical Society's journal that they published that's devoted just to this issue. It has a different, there it is. It has a chapter, one chapter for each of the suffrage stories for the 9 states that comprise the Ninth Circuit. So I'm going to do this quickly, but if anybody wants more information, just call me in chambers. I'm happy to send you a copy of this journal article. Great, so broadly speaking, I'll start there. Broadly speaking, the 4 takeaways from my research that really surprised me are first, that the actual progress of the suffrage movement went from west to east. I would have thought it was the other way around, but it's not the case. Second, that the suffrage movement was very definitely a continuation of the 15th Amendment. It had overt racial overtones. It was not just about gender when they were talking about the 19th Amendment. Third, it's wrong to think of Jim Crow laws as being relics from the Deep South. There were Jim Crow laws alive and well, unfortunately, in the West, and including in Alaska during the time that we're talking about. And finally, that ratification of the 19th Amendment did not mean that all women could vote, any more than ratification of the 15th meant that all African American men could vote. In the wake of both of those constitutional amendments, there were a number of barriers that were set up that prevented people from voting for decades. There were literacy tests and poll taxes, and we'll talk about some of the other barriers today. So when people think of the word suffragist, and I use suffragist, not suffragette, because that was a disparaging term actually at the time. But when people think of suffragists, it's much like this photo. You know, I certainly thought of women with the big hats and the long dresses. And that's where I started. In fact, fashion changed dramatically because this campaign took 70 years. So you'll see suffragists dressed very, very differently in many of the photos. I thought of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and those women were hugely important to this campaign, no question about it. But it's important to recognize they had almost nothing to show for it after decades of work trying to raise awareness. They didn't have concrete measures. Neither of them lived to see the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Neither of them ever voted lawfully. Susan B. Anthony did vote very famously once as an act of civil disobedience in order to be arrested, but they really didn't live to see the day. It was the Western states, as shown here, that first granted women the right to vote. Wyoming Territory was first in 1869. My colleague, Judge Margaret McEwen, loves that because that's her home state. She's very proud of that fact. Followed by Colorado, Utah, and Idaho, all before the turn of the century. Progress in the West caused women in the East to wonder why women in New York couldn't vote when women in California could. There are several theories about why the suffrage movement progressed as it did from West to East. One is that some of the territories and states out West were granting women the right to vote because they wanted to vie for statehood to the extent they didn't already have it, which was true for most of them. And that the idea was that women would come flooding in. At least that was a projection and prediction that was often made, but it wasn't true. The census data showed that women did not flock to the states where suffrage had been granted. A second theory, which most historians credit, is that the Mormon Church was very instrumental. Everywhere the suffrage battles were fought, the liquor industry opposed suffrage. The thought was that if women had the right to vote, they would vote to outlaw alcohol. The Mormon Church was already, not aligned with the liquor industry, and apparently didn't mind taking on that very formidable opponent. So that may have been part of the reason that the movement gained footholds out West first. And finally, there's a demographic study that I don't know if it's a study, but a demographic breakdown that I came across in doing my research of the Washington legislature. And it broke them down by age and religion and where they came from and within the state and occupation. The only common denominator is farmers overwhelmingly granted the right to suffrage for women. I haven't seen anything scholarly written about that. It strikes me, though, as unsurprising that men who had wives and daughters working right alongside them, doing very, very heavy manual physical labor, would have been among the first to vote to adopt suffrage. This is a photo that I included because it's included in the Ninth Circuit Historical Journal. This is a woman working in Montana at about that time, and it's a great reminder, I think, of how tough, how much tougher the physical work was that men and women were called upon to do in that day. At any rate, there's no question that the suffrage campaign in Washington was very critical, not only to Alaska, but really to the whole campaign in the lower 48, because there was a big dry spell. After those 4 states adopted suffrage, then nothing happened for 14 years. And the organizers out east were getting pretty desperate. In Washington state, the story begins around the time of the Civil War, when the Washington legislature adopted a measure allowing all white citizens over the age of 21 to vote. their intention was to disenfranchise African American men, but there were certainly white women in Washington over the age of 21, so they decided that that applied to them, and some of them started showing up at the polls, and some of them were allowed to vote. Most of them were turned away, but some of them were allowed to vote. In 1871, Susan B. Anthony came to Washington and Oregon on a 2-month speaking tour. And by the end of her tour, she had received a lot of favorable press coverage. She had a hard road to hoe. She would start out her speeches, and they invariably, the newspaper coverage would begin by reporting that she was unmarried, tall, bony, plain, just brutal. But she pressed on, and she started to get a lot of heads were turning, especially among newspaper publishers, because they had a hard time refuting what she had to say. Women in Washington state won and lost the right to vote 3 different times. And ironically, it's probably the case that on Susan B. Anthony's last speech to the Washington legislature, she was so well received that the Washington legislature then, that day, adopted a bill to clarify any ambiguity in that Civil War era statute. And they clarified that they meant all white male adults over the age of 21 should be allowed to vote. The irony being that the first time the women in Washington lost the right to vote, it was probably because of a speech given by Susan B. Anthony. The legislature there adopted 2 more measures in the 1880s to give women the right to vote, but the Washington Territorial Supreme Court struck both of them down. I'm not going to go into these here. I've written about them in the journal article, but here are the citations if anyone is interested. The short version for today's purposes that gives you an idea of what these women were up against is that one member of the Washington Territorial Supreme Court was so opposed to granting women suffrage that he actually resigned his seat from the court so that he could take up the cause and argue a particular case to the court on behalf of the people who were opposing women's suffrage. So it wasn't a subtle opposition. The women in Washington realized they were, and men, male suffragists as well, realized they were going to have to get a constitutional amendment, and that's what they set out to do. It took several tries, but that was true of most states and territories. And these 2 women I've selected to show you. Emma DeVoe was sent by the national organization out to Seattle because they started to see that they had some hope of breaking that log jam because the legislature had been so amenable. Emma Smith DeVoe really embodies one of 2 ways this movement went. She was quiet and refined and unfailingly polite. She adopted what she called a still hunt campaign, where women would avoid any opposition or confrontation, and they were to lobby grassroots to their husbands and brothers and sons, and sort of very, very low-key approach. She started all of her talks, which she liked to do in private homes, by singing a little song. She apparently had a lovely singing voice. And then there was May Arkwright Hutton, and she's here shown on the right. She's absolutely the opposite. She was physically imposing. She had enjoyed the right to vote in Idaho when she lived there. In fact, she was almost elected to the legislature there. And not a bit amused when she and her husband moved to Spokane and she lost the right to vote. You would not have missed this woman in Spokane if you'd met her, because she wore a zebra skin coat and drove herself around Spokane in a red car. Her motto was that there is no such thing as bad publicity. And they were rivals of sorts. It's a longer story, but fun to read about. At any rate, those 2 approaches were sort of in conflict, not only in Washington state, but throughout the lower 48 as this. And so the story in Washington is very, very, very typical that way. They kept their eye on the prize. They just went after it in different ways. In the end, they were remarkably successful. When the amendment was passed in Washington in 1910, it was passed in every county in the state by a 2-to-1 margin. So they did a really great job. This cartoon shows to the Washington, is they say that Uncle Sam's newest baby girl. So that's the 5th state being handed over to Uncle Sam to commemorate the Washington campaign. When I started this research, I thought I was going to see the very same or a similar kind of story up here in Alaska, because this story in Washington, except that it was first to break that logjam, pretty typical of other states. But it's entirely different in Alaska. and as you will see. So this next slide, I wish I could tell you it was a woman, marching in Juneau or something, but she's not. This is President Woodrow Wilson's niece. She represented Alaska at a suffrage parade that was held in New York City in 1915, where the women in New York were complaining, even in Alaska, they have the right to vote. What's the deal? Why don't we have it here? Jumping into our story up here, I just want to give a little bit of a word of caution. I have condensed the historical part of this program significantly, but not in any effort to sugarcoat it. Part of this history is hard to hear, and I just want to give people a little bit of a warning about that. This next photo of the Ketchikan Courthouse is a reminder of the times we're talking about. It's hard for us to imagine now how absent women were from public life about 100 years ago. It's not just that women weren't judges or lawyers, except that's true. They weren't clerks of the court. They were not present on the scene in any real way. For fun and to make sure that I don't exclude the judiciary from this discrimination, I've included a couple photos of the Ninth Circuit's headquarters in San Francisco. It was open, same time, right after the turn of the century in 1905, just before San Francisco's big fire. We don't have horses and buggies out front like that anymore, but it's the very same exterior of the building if you come to visit in San Francisco, and I hope you will. It's a beautiful building. This building, the interiors are very grand. There's marble. It was touted as the modern showplace. You say it had electric lights and running water, and both of those features were very big deals because the federal government wanted to make a real statement about its presence out on the West Coast. As grand and as modern as this building was, I use it in these talks because I want to remind everybody this thing was built without any women's bathrooms. Women didn't go to courthouses. They weren't particularly welcome, and at that point, they couldn't even serve on juries. This building in particular housed every federal agency that existed in California was in this one building in the Browning, and the architects apparently didn't anticipate that women would have a need to go do business in any of those places. So it's a long way of saying, I think we really have to keep in mind just how thoroughly women were excluded at that time. I mentioned that when the suffrage movement was going on in Alaska, it was going right alongside two major efforts. One was this growing push to outlaw alcohol, but also a push for statehood, because it was so widely assumed that women would vote to clean up elections, and there would be no more graft or corruption if women were involved in politics. They also thought that the fate of alcohol was going to hang in the balance depending on whether women did or didn't get the right to vote. And that's what really influenced a lot of attitudes about the suffrage movement. Very quick history in this next slide about Alaska to sort of orient all of us. First, of course, in 1867, Alaska was purchased from Russia. The Organic Act of 1888 is when we became a district, and our first federal courts were formed. Pretty rudimentary, but that's what happened then. The next real bold point, I think, is the gold rush. Between 1890 and 1900, the census shows that our population just about doubled from about 32,000 to about 64,000. 17,000 of those people were women. In 1904, things started to look up. Congress granted the right to vote to all adult citizens in Alaska. The first elections where women were allowed to vote up here were school board elections. That was also very typical in the lower 48, probably because at that time, one of the few professions women could participate in was, at least unmarried women, could work as teachers. So perhaps it's unsurprising that they were allowed to vote in school board elections first. In other places, women were allowed to vote only in really minor elections. In Washington state, for example, the first election where women were allowed to vote was just to select the state flower, and which may have been an insult. I included this photo of women in Bellingham because I like to think that they look annoyed by that first vote. In response to the 1904 statute that allowed all citizens to vote for school boards, the Daily Alaskan newspaper proclaimed that, quote unquote, all citizens included women. and that Alaska women could be trusted to exercise the right to vote even though they hadn't asked for it. That attitude that the right to vote had been very magnanimously granted to women without parades or marches is ubiquitous in the newspaper articles at the time. In fact, women did petition that first legislature to adopt a suffrage bill. We'll talk about that in just a minute. The woman who did that was a veteran of the campaigns in Washington state. In the days leading up to the first session of our territorial legislature, the Fairbanks newspaper explained, quote, "Alaskan women are different. They aren't the pampered dolls of society, but brave and noble helpers in the development of a frontier country. Alaskan women fought hard in the battle of life right alongside their husbands, and for that, the editor decided that they had earned the right to vote." In 1906, Congress approved a non-voting congressional delegate for Alaska, which might sound like progress, although they specified that only men would be allowed to vote for the non-voting delegate. And in 1912, Alaska finally became a territory. And with that, Congress came close. They almost gave women the right to vote. The congressional record is sort of fun to read. One representative argued on the floor that, quote, "women aren't making any worse job about where they have the right to vote than the men are," and also said, "We cannot have a free country. We cannot claim to have a real democracy as long as fully 1/2 of the citizens of the country are disenfranchised." But in the end, despite there's quite a bit of lofty language, in the end, Congress punted to the new legislature and left it to them to make the choice. So it was in March of 1913 that our newly minted territorial legislature first met, and as its very first act, it granted the right to women to vote. Only one legislator dissented. I want to make sure everybody knows this person's name. He'll live in infamy, Senator Elwood Brunner from Nome. And the record, I was really amused to see, the record shows that he, quote, "had the good sense or caution to absent himself during roll call." So the senator apparently stayed home that day. This is a photo of Governor Clark signing the women's suffrage bill, and you'll notice and recognize that's Judge James, well, actually at that point, Congressman James Wickersham standing off to the right. Alaska's bill was signed 6 years before the 19th Amendment was ratified, so the women on the East Coast were still waiting. The governor of Alaska declared that Alaska's measure had been a quote unquote unqualified success. This is a letter that he wrote to some organizers in New York City touting the successful campaign here. What had looked like a quick and easy path to suffrage was shown in this next cartoon, and it compares women in Alaska to the women in London who'd had such a hard time. So you see on the top, she's standing there hanging up her laundry. She's all neat and tidy, and the legislature's bowing very chivalrously and holding out, giving her the suffrage bill. And down below, this woman is being pelted with rocks and treated horribly. But this cartoon was misleading, and Governor Strong's proclamation that it had been an unqualified success here was also incomplete. Alaska Natives had voted since the very beginning of electoral politics, and but when Congress granted the right to vote to citizens in Alaska, it actually disenfranchised Alaska Native men and women, that is, because there was no agreement that Alaska Natives were United States citizens. Some argued that Natives living in Alaska at that time were not citizens because they were born before the state was a state, before Alaska was a state, or even when it had been part of the Russian territory. But the Department of Interior argued that Alaska Natives deserved the right to vote because they had been self-supporting taxpayers and good citizens, meaning citizens in the general sense, as opposed to the legal sense. Two decisions from the federal judges up here split on the issue. James Wickersham wrote one of them. It was called In Re Minuk, and you can find that in the Reporters. It's also a really interesting read. In 1915, the Alaska Territorial Legislature passed a law expressly conferring citizenship to Alaska Natives, which you would have thought would have solved the problem, but that citizenship came at an incredibly steep price. It's probably the most heartbreaking part of the story for me. I'm going to ask Elizabeth Hensley, who I hope is not muted, if she could maybe tell us about the barriers that the legislature enacted after the 1913 vote.
Okay, good afternoon. It's an honor to be here with you, Judge Kristen, and all the panelists. Hello, everybody out there. I'm Sagulik Elizabeth Hensley, and I am an attorney at Landy Bennett Blumstein. When I think of this subject, I think of first my white great-grandmother who came to Alaska in the early 1900s. And I think of my Inuit grandmother and her sister and all of these folks and how different life was for them living at the same time, just because one was white and the others were Inuit. So that's kind of the context I think about these things within. As an Inuit person, I was raised knowing that there was a time when we had to prove that we were not savages in order to vote. That was part of just, the general growing up conversations. As a lawyer, I know now that there was this law in 1915 that the territorial government passed the law requiring us to demonstrate that we were civilized, that we weren't savages. And we needed to sever all tribal relationships and adopt the habits of civilized life in order to be able to vote. And this was a process, right? We needed to complete an application for citizenship. We needed to submit to an examination demonstrating we had abandoned our tribal customs. We needed to seek the support of 5 white citizens who had been permanent residents of Alaska for at least a year, who would attest to the fact that in their best judgment, we were not savages anymore. We were civilized. We needed to take an oath acknowledging that I would, forever renounce all tribal customs and relationships. And after that, okay, we need to attend a hearing before a federal district court judge who would then presumably decide whether or not we passed the test and had become civilized rather than savage. And Native women who wish to vote in Alaska could be required to do a similar severing of tribal ties, or to marry a white man who could vote, or a Native man who had taken all the steps required to abandon his tribal ties. So I suppose that would put me out on the lookout for a white man to marry if I wanted to vote. So from there, and I think this is our next slide, please. We've got the 1925 literacy tests. So we know in 1924, Congress conferred citizenship on all non-citizen Indians born within the territorial limits of the United States via the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, which could have rendered the civility test obsolete, and because it granted citizenship to Alaska Native people without qualification. However, the territorial government created a new barrier to voting in the form of this literacy test. So we, as Native people, would have needed to establish that we were literate by legibly signing our names, recording our sex and address in a book, and then we would need to either read in English in the presence publicly of an election officer, a passage of not less than 10 lines chosen at random by the election officer from the Constitution, and etc. So there was a literacy test, just another barrier. That, of course, was a territorial requirement, but Congress later in 1927 adopted a similar literacy test. I know Jane's going to talk a little bit about the Constitutional Convention next, but just leading up to that, people continued to live within this racist system for quite some time until World War II came about and there were forced evacuations of Alaska Natives to Southeast Alaska, and people started to think about perhaps changing our ways. In 1945, there was an equal rights bill outlawing segregation. In 1959, of course, Alaska became a state, and the Alaska Constitution created a far more lenient English fluency test. However, it wasn't until 1970, more than 50 years after Alaska's legislature adopted a suffrage provision for women, that voters ratified a constitutional amendment striking the final version of the literacy test from the Constitution. That was 1970. That was 13 years before I was born. So I think with my closing remarks, I'll just say, we think about how these things seem like so distant in the past, and that we've got this state now where everybody is on equal footing and we can all kind of live our American dream here in Alaska. But it's not that simple. And when you are raised in a family line with people who were so severely disenfranchised, you see the effects today. And so in my parting comments, I'll just ask everybody to consider, how do we see the effects of this type of disenfranchisement in our lives today? And we know that the Alaska Bar Association is 95% white. Is that, we should critically ask ourselves, is some of the history of our state that was so recent, is that showing up in things like who has the privilege of practicing law, etc. So thank you very much for having me here today, Judge Kristen, and I will sign off.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Jane, I'm going to turn to you next, since you're married to my favorite delegate to the Constitutional Convention. Maybe you could talk just a little bit about how the literacy tests, they lasted from 1925 right up to the Constitutional Convention here. Could you talk a little bit about how those came to become obsolete?
Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here and delighted to have the subject of how goes it with Alaska with respect to women's access to voting and women's access to the governance structures of our state. As Elizabeth so aptly described, the literacy test was actually intended to be the barrier to prevent Alaska Native people or anyone else who wasn't a white male, for the most part, from participating in elections. And it was during the Constitutional Convention, which convened between the fall and winter of 1995 to 1956. There were 55 people in the Constitutional Convention. 6 of them are women, and the others were men. But they came from all over the state, and they came with the hopes of creating a new tomorrow for Alaska. There was one delegate who was an Alaska Native person, whose name was Frank Peratrovich from Juneau. And he concluded that, having watched what had occurred from 1913 forward in the territorial days of Alaska, that the literacy test was really a barrier to many people being able to participate in elections, not the least of whom were the Tlingit people whom he represented, and who had dedicated their lives through the creation of the Alaska Native Brotherhood and the Alaska Native Sisterhood to demonstrate their capacity to engage in citizenship activities in the United States of America. So Frank Peratrovich proposed a change in the law of the state of Alaska, and it changed the definition of the literacy test to be able to speak the English language, as opposed to being required to read and write. And that actually provided opportunity not only for the Tlingit people, the indigenous people across the state, but also many other new immigrant families who had come to the United States of America and to the territory of Alaska. So as a piece of our gift of statehood to the rest of the country, we made sure that all people in Alaska had the opportunity to vote, and that they worked really hard to try to just eliminate the literacy test and say that the test was, could you speak? And that was actually only required to be able to say, hello, my name is Jane Ambick and I live in Anchorage, Alaska. And so the test was, can you say your name? Can you articulate where you live so that you could actually vote in the continuation? And that is one of the stories that is my fondest story that I hear. I'm married to Vic Fisher, who is the last living delegate of the Constitution. And he has lots of stories, but he also likes this one as well, that we have facilitated the opportunity for Indigenous people or people who are immigrants from all over the world to participate in the election process simply by being able to speak the English language. That's it.
It was a very progressive provision at the time. Jane, some of the historical accounts make it sound as though women in Alaska, as I mentioned earlier, as though they didn't even ask for the right to vote. And I know that's not quite right. Women in Alaska have worked really long and hard in any number of civil rights movements, provisions. And I'm wondering, could you tell us a little bit about some of the women in the Alaska Hall of Fame?
Absolutely. There should be a picture of the first hero is Cornelia Templeton Hatcher. And there you go, Morgan, look at the hat. It's great.
I love the hat.
Cornelia was born in the lower 48 and was educated and became a journalist. She started out laying print copy for a local newspaper when she was young. Then she became a person who could actually write stories, and then she actually became an educated journalist. She came to the Northwest to go to the International Exposition in 1910 in Seattle, and came north and spent 3 weeks going through Alaska in 1910 and loved the same thing that many newcomers today love, which is the mountains and the beauty of the place. But she was particularly concerned about the temperance movement. And as Morgan had explained, the temperance movement was very entwined with the effort to secure the rights of American women to be able to vote. And their thought was that at the time that alcohol was very destructive to a home and family, and that what we will have is a stronger nation if we don't have any alcohol. And so she was a very strong member of the Temperance Union and was the editor of their national newspaper. And when she came to Alaska, she fell in love with a miner, a guy named Hatcher, a guy named Mr. Hatcher, who was who didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't chew, and was probably the only guy in the territory of Alaska who didn't do those things. So it made sense for them to get married. And what she did was started a petition. She came in 1910, married in 1911, and in the winter of 1912 started a petition of Alaskans to tell the territorial legislature that was going to come into being in 1913 that women should have the right to vote. And she got 400 people to sign that petition from all over the state. She was living in Knik in the wintertime, which is a pretty desolate place. And she got into several arguments with the people who were running the local hotel there. And they argued that women didn't have the ability to make those big, heavy decisions. And she thought it would be, in fact, preposterous that a place that has 2/3 of the population as just men could make any decisions that were going to make sense if they didn't have the presence of women in their participation. So she did sign the petition, and she is the first petition signer, organizer, and it was the first petition presented to the territorial legislature, who at the time were more than willing to have women be voting members because they too were trying to demonstrate that they were a grown-up government who had the capacity to do that. Cornelia also would go back and forth between Alaska and the United States Congress in Washington, D.C. And she was a very strong advocate for temperance. And as territory, the National Congress had to approve Alaska voting for the Temperance Act first before they could do anything about that here. And secondly, she was very concerned about the fact that there wasn't an education system. And so she secured a $100,000 appropriation from the United States Congress to initiate the education systems of Alaska. So Cornelia Templeton Hatcher is quite the woman who not only led the fight for women to be able to secure the vote through the very first territorial legislature, but also the first federal appropriation for education. So let's hear it for Cornelia. If we fast forward 40 years from there, we come to another hero of Alaska, who is Elizabeth Karatovich, a 5 foot tall, beautiful Tlingit woman who was born in Petersburg, raised in Ketchikan, and came to Juneau with her new husband in 1941. And they had great difficulty finding housing because there turns out that there were lots of signs around that said no natives and no dogs allowed. And that although they had jobs and they had money, they could not find a home because there was, they didn't call it redlining then, but there were certain areas where Native people could have their homes. And they didn't think that it was appropriate for their growing family to be living in a hovel someplace. So she took up the question of sitting in the legislature, sitting in the balcony in 1945 when they were discussing the Anti-Discrimination Act of 1945. And the person who spoke before her was another poor guy who said that Alaskans, why should we give the vote to Alaskans who are barely out of savagery? And Elizabeth was sitting there knitting, as she did when she participated in meetings. And she stood up in the gallery of the Alaska State Territorial Legislature and said, well, excuse me, sir, but those of us who have recently been in savagery relative to your long 5,000 years history are in great need of protection to be able to make sure that we have the right to buy homes, to seek employment, and to maintain our life without racial discrimination. And the colleagues were so mortified by the gentleman who had just stood and said, you who have been out just away from savagery were done in by this 5 foot tall, beautiful Tlingit woman who in a very calm voice said, it is not right that we cannot have discrimination against people because of their race for being able to engage. And at the signing process of that particular law, the governor gave his pen to her. She is only a woman at the signing of the legislation where it's Governor Greening who's signing the petition. We have another glorious opportunity to honor Elizabeth Karatovich, is that she is now one of the people, if you go back one picture, this coin, the $1 bill coin, has the features of Elizabeth Karatovich on it. And so I have grandchildren who have that coin as a gift that they got at Christmas time because they'd never seen a coin with a woman on it before. The last heroine who we're going to discuss today is a young woman. Her name is Alberta Schenck Adams. And when she was a teenager in Nome, there was the movie theater had a sign that said, this is a whites only area, and this is and that's the only people who can sit there. And Alberta thought that was not right. And so she went and she persuaded her boyfriend to sit with her at the movie theater in the white only section. And they refused to allow her to sit there, and she refused to move. And as a result, she was arrested in Nome, Alaska, because she had violated the rule of the movie house that said that they couldn't have a white only section. This is 8 years before Rosa Parks got up to fight about her seat in the bus. And she was arrested and taken off to jail. And the Inupiat people who lived in Nome were so outraged that they went and marched against the jail to release that young woman who was standing up for her own rights. And the result is that policy at that movie theater changed, and it greatly affected the consideration of the 1945 Civil Rights Act in the state of Alaska. So we have spectacular women who were coming to us in 1910 and 11, brave women in 1945, and Alberta Schenck Adams was standing up for civil rights in Alaska in the 60s. So those are some of the heroes from Alaska's history.
Thank you, Jane. Renee Wardlaw, I hope you're still there. I can't see you. There you are. Great. We've talked a lot about how absent women were at the time of the 19th Amendment. And I wonder if you could help us fast forward. We want to be a forward-looking program, but with this background, can you help us fast forward and compare the very different picture that exists today?
Absolutely. Thank you, Judge, for having me. And I've just been blessed by hearing from all the panelists thus far and those to come. So thank you for having me a part of the program today. And I think you're right. The role of women is vastly different, certainly for women who look like me particularly, but for all women since the 19th Amendment was ratified. And just some statistics on some of the research done in preparation for this panel. 6% of married women worked outside of the home. I know almost all of us on this call certainly work outside of the home and in the home, or both. And the statistics from Department of Labor at that time suggested that those 6% of women actually were really either had spouses who were unemployed or were widows. So we're talking about women who were really in a position where they had to work, whereas many of us choose to work, which I think is a choice that we all are lucky to be able to make and have our own independence. Two of those occupations, of course, the judge has mentioned teachers, which I'm lucky to be married to an educator, so I'm proud of that fact, and nursing. And women continue to be trailblazers in those two fields today. But we also have farm laborers and those women who are involved in light industry. So women, even at that time, were involved in some of those fields, but we continue to expand that, including some of the lawyers who are on this call today. And that's long before the Equal Pay Act. If you look at the legislative history, and I was interested in looking at this, when we're fighting just for what equal pay means today, and we're certainly not done with that fight, even in the legislative history and passing that, there were employers who had a different pay scale for men and a different pay scale for women. So that simply suggests that a woman's work would not be valued as much as a man. And I think that we would all stand against that today and continue to stand against that. It also shows that when we talk about 6% of women who were working, it certainly wasn't accounting for the women who do all of the hard work that many of us do in the home in support of our partners, in support of our children, and in support of our loved ones. So the differences are vast across the board, but certainly those are a couple of the highlights that I came across in my research, Judge.
Thanks, Renee. I think you can still hear me, I hope. I don't think I'm muted. Yeah, good. Okay, great. Renee, can you talk a little bit about the glass ceiling here, whether we have one? One of the reasons I stayed in Alaska when I came here as an extern is that there were so many women on the bench. It seemed to be a really different climate here in Alaska than in the lower 48. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I share that sentiment with you, Judge, that one of the reasons I came to Alaska 10 years ago was because of the opportunities presented here. But when we talk about the glass ceiling, I actually just wanted to get a clear definition. So in doing a quick Google search, my favorite research tool, the glass ceiling is defined as an unofficially acknowledged barrier to the advancement in a profession, especially affecting women and members of minorities. I, of course, am in both those classes. And the term was first popularized in the 80s to describe the challenges that women and minorities would face in their careers, ultimately being stagnant. So while you may have entry into the room, you may be stalled at where you can go in the room. And I think that we all continue the fight to be able to enter at any point in our careers and work against that stagnation. And I did a bit of research. A couple of key facts that I found from Department of Labor and from my research on the glass ceiling is that both men and women are more likely to hire men. So again, it kind of begins with us. So I give those facts to you to consider. And men are 30% more likely to achieve managerial roles. A bit scary as some of us think about achieving those managerial roles and maintaining them. And women only make up 23% of the C-suite, with women of color only making up 4% of the C-suite. That's today. So we can only think about the trailblazing that has been done, but the trailblazing that needs to continue to be done. And women receive pay raises 5% less often than men. So again, I'm really lucky to be in a room full of women who continue that fight. The glass ceiling is alive today in every sector. And Alaska, I don't suggest that Alaska is immune, but I think about the fact that I've been able to start my practice in Alaska, first in Juneau and Anchorage, and be around dynamic, talented women throughout my entire career. And I moved here, like I said, Judge, and like you also indicated, because there were opportunities that were available to young women, particularly of young women of color, that I didn't see in the lower 48. Other challenges, certainly, but still opportunities. So we balance that out. And when I talk to some of the working professionals and some that are participating today, I'm just filled with awesome opportunities in all areas of the legal profession and otherwise. And I'll use my current job as an example. I currently work at an Alaska Native corporation, as Marilyn stated, and I'm proud of the long-standing trend of women leaders in the ANC world. So I'm proud to work on behalf of the shareholders of Bristol Bay Native Corporation. And just by way of example, our legal and compliance departments at BBNC are made up entirely of women. So you can think of that as a huge proud moment, with 67% of the women in those departments being women of color, including myself. So I say that to say that that wasn't a mere chance. That was certainly by a conscious decision by the women and men in leadership at Bristol Bay Native Corporation. And I hope that, you know, for those of us who have influence, who continue to strive to obtain influence and to sustain influence, that we will work together, not just with other women, but with other men, to at least continue the trend of Alaska to empower women in the workplace.
Thanks, Renee. I'm going to go to Elizabeth Hodis now. We're going to talk in a minute about the way societal norms have changed, cultural norms have changed in the wake of the 19th Amendment. Before we get to that, though, Elizabeth, could you talk a little bit about how women's codified legal rights have changed in the last 100 years?
Of course. Thank you. You know, I as I was thinking about this section of our presentation, I think it is kind of striking how many of these really significant laws we take for granted now, and it sort of going back to the comment that Renee made, and I think even that Liz Hensley made about it just hasn't been that long. I mean, even 100 years ago just is not that long, but certainly things that are 30, 40 years ago, you know, we think of as being really far off in the past. But 100 years ago, women in most places, you know, when they got married, anything she owned became the property of her husband, right? And women could not, if they were married, could not enter into contracts. So you enter into a marriage, you lose all your property, you don't have a right to enter into contracts. And yet at the same time, there were also very real risks even to the personal safety of a woman entering into a marriage. So for example, I think it's important to remember that domestic violence at those times was something that in most cases, even rape, would have been rarely prosecuted, and only in very extreme circumstances. So when a woman entered into a marriage, if it was with someone who potentially could put her in a domestic violence situation, she would have no way to get out of that situation. And we recognize that today. But I think it's, you know, it was even more stark at that time. There was no such thing as a no-fault divorce, or a dissolution 100 years ago. So if a woman married into that kind of abusive relationship, and she wanted to get a divorce, and even if she were able to obtain a divorce, she was most likely going to lose her right to her children. Probably visitation rights to her children, not just custody, but custody and visitation. There were laws against women having their own bank accounts, lines of credit, those sorts of things. So the idea of having any kind of financial independence was not realistic for most women at that time. And until the passage of the Cable Act in 1922, a woman could even lose her United States citizenship if she married a man from whose citizenship was outside of the United States. I think that in particular, that law is really fascinating. The idea of losing your United States citizenship just based on who you marry is really kind of mind-blowing, and that was 1922, less than 100 years ago. So I just, as we're talking through all of this history, I do continue in my own analysis to come back to this idea that we take for granted so many of these changes in the law that affect our everyday lives in such a significant way, and back to Liz's point that it has not been that long since those changes were made, and I think in my generation, sometimes we have a tendency to sort of lose sight of those changes.
Thanks, Liz. I think that's right. I remember talking to my grandmother, who was a professional working woman, and she went to college assuming she would never vote. And I remember her telling me that. It just stopped me in my tracks. I couldn't believe it. Wasn't that long ago. That's right. I'm going to turn now to Professor Pace, who I think is still muted, but she's going to fix that. As a political scientist, I'm hoping that I have your outline here, and I'm really anxious to hear your comments about how and why, from your perspective, this sea change was able to happen in this short period of time.
Well, thank you, Judge Kristen, and I'm honored to be here on this panel with these wonderful panelists. It's been great to listen to everyone. I am continuously fascinated by the fact that, as was just mentioned, Elizabeth just mentioned, it hasn't been that long, right? It's barely over 100 years, barely now. But when we look at that 100-year time span, really and truly, I think remarkable things have happened, continue to happen, and will continue to happen in the future based on what it is that we're going to do, right, with our votes and our rights. So I'm excited to talk about those types of things. So if we could advance to the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. Just tiptoeing just a teeny tiny bit back, Judge Kristen did a great job of talking about what I title as a women's historian, I suppose, the first wave of feminists. And the first wave of feminists, I think most people sort of pinpoint that date as 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention. And I think that's when the nation really takes notice of women activists, and particularly around the subject of suffrage. But in fact, there had been a conference 100 years prior to that not a lot of people talk about. And that particular conference was fascinating. There were about 100 participants, give or take, and roughly half of them were white women, and roughly half of them were Black women. Nobody talks about that, right? And they were discussing two subjects which were intertwined at the time, and that was, of course, suffrage and abolition. And they met, they had vigorous discussions, and then somehow or another that history sort of fades away. And the next time when we hear about women's suffrage is really in 1848 at Seneca Falls. At that particular conference in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, there were white women that were present, and Frederick Douglass. Don't want to forget Frederick Douglass, who was there. But Black women were absent, more or less absent from Seneca Falls in 1848, and still tied very much to the idea of suffrage tying to abolition, with the idea being, let's move forward and get both of these done at the same time, right? Let's abolish slavery, and let's also have women's suffrage be passed. So the idea was that both those things could happen at the same time. Sojourner Truth, and on my previous slide, there's a picture of Sojourner Truth, and she was involved in those conversations as well, both of those. But there just weren't a lot of Black women or Native American women or immigrant women that were involved in the fight, or publicly involved in the fight, I suppose, at that time in 1848. Okay, we can go on to the next one, please. Thank you. Great. Second wave, so those were the first wave feminists. The second wave of feminists really, I would say, really, I would argue, to start to take place around the early 1900s. And again, predominantly led by white women, young white women predominantly. And on the East Coast, the names that sort of percolate to the surface pretty early on are on the left, Alice Paul, and her good friend and right-hand assistant, I suppose, help was Lucy Burns. And if you haven't seen Iron-Jawed Angels yet, I encourage you all to see the 2004 film Iron-Jawed Angels, because it does, I think, a pretty darn good job of telling this history. And it's the film that turned me around on Hilary Swank as an actress, so good film. These two women, young women, very educated, had been very active in a women's suffrage movement in England and came back to the United States. They were both from the US, and took up the fight here in the early 1900s, around 1912. They were adamant about, again, continuing the right to vote with the push for women's suffrage movement. They were initially connected to NASA, the National American Suffrage Women's Association. They were initially connected to that. And that was the organization that had been started by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony back in the 1840s. And that organization persisted even into the early 1900s. But they were convinced that the way to go for women to get the right to vote was a state-by-state campaign. So go New York, go New Jersey or Ohio or whatever. They were convinced that a state-by-state campaign was the way to go. And Alice Paul and Lucy Burns had a different spin, and they were pushing for a constitutional amendment. They thought a constitutional amendment which would grant all women across the country to vote would be the way to go. And so after kind of like tossing and turning, I suppose, amongst those two, it was really generational at that point. The women of Nassau, Carrie Chapman, and Alice Paul and Lucy Burns and their organization. Their organization really was comprised of women and migrants, the immigrants that were new to the country, not a lot of Black women or women of minority status at that time. Not a lot, a few. Ida B. Wells really fought really hard to be included and was participating to some extent. These two women at one point grew so frustrated with NASA, the National American Women's Association, Suffrage Association, that they actually split. And they formed their own political party, the National Women's Party. And the National Women's Party was a single issue party. And we've had a few of those in our nation's history. One issue, and they're fighting for the one issue and the one issue only. And that was for women to get the right to vote and to pass this constitutional amendment. And they formed around 1912, 1913, and they would continue to push for that until ultimately the 19th Amendment is passed in 1920, which we are all aware of today. And that language in the 19th Amendment is the original language from Susan B. Anthony and what she proposed. But as I said, not a lot of minorities were included in that second wave feminism, as we would say. So that leads us to the third wave, if you will, which is the next slide, please. Great, thank you. And that's third wave feminism. And third wave feminism I would say it really comes to the forefront in the 1960s and 1970s. And these are pictures of women that you probably are familiar with. On the left is Gloria Steinem, and she was very powerful in the women's movement, and particularly getting more women to more women voting. Women had the right to vote at that point in time, although there was discrimination, of course, for minorities in voting, and I would argue continues today. But she was very big on actually getting women voting and voting on political issues, right? What are great women's issues that women should be voting on? And she was very powerful and passionate in that movement and continues to be today. She actually maybe it was 2018, she was at UAF, and she gave a very powerful speech at UAF talking about women's voting and the policy changes and how important they are in, when women turn out to vote, how important that is, right? And again, that more women vote than any other group, right? So women voting is so critically important. So she continues to be very active on the stage. Another person, a counterpart, if you will, was Betty Friedan. That's the person next to her, next to the right on her. And Betty Friedan, very powerful, very active, also in promoting women getting the right, or women actually exercising the right to vote, but also getting politically active in terms of running for office and running for political positions and political party positions and that kind of thing. And she was quite active in that. Next to her is Shirley Chisholm, and Shirley Chisholm involved in that movement, but perhaps just slightly outside of it. She was a member of Congress in the late 60s, early 70s. And in 1972, Shirley Chisholm did what no other woman had ever legally done before, and that is to run for president. And she does far better than anyone, I think, had ever given her credit for. And she ran on the Democratic ticket, was not successful, but certainly served as an example and inspiration for so many other women, both white women and women of color, to get politically involved. And if you're going to open the door for all women, you need to open the door for all women. And so, of course, that meant not only liberal or progressive women, but also conservative women. And so on the far right is a picture of Phyllis Schlafly, who was also very much in favor of women voting. And she definitely had a political agenda. It was simply a more conservative agenda than any of the three prior women that are on the side would have supported. But all women means all women. So we include Phyllis Schlafly, of course, as well. And if you wouldn't mind switching to the next slide. So, what are the next steps, right? In this idea of, third wave feminism. Voting rights have been established with some difficulty, of course, and one could, again, as I said, could argue whether or not those voting rights are firmly established, or if there are still some ambiguities there and suppression going on. But that's for another talk. And then policy, right? What policy are women supporting, or how are they supporting policy? And that's just not women's issues, that's all things, right? That could be everything from foreign policy to economic policy to, individual states, what's important to your state, what are you vested in, school boards, going back to, you can vote for school board. All those things are very important, right? And so, women, of course, very active in all policy areas as well. Women holding elected office, now more than ever. 2018, we saw more women than ever running for political office and being elected. I was just listening this morning, to an NPR report that said that Donald Trump's presidency might have been the best thing for the women's movement, which I hadn't really ever thought about it in that way before. But their argument, the journalist's argument, was that more women now than ever. are active and out and are speaking up and are participating in record numbers. More women holding office in Congress. We now have 26 women in the Senate, so 26% of the Senate, and 23.2% of the members of the House of Representatives are women. That is higher than ever before. And it continues, right? So more women running for or holding elected office. We have a woman on the Democratic ticket with Kamala Harris. So coming up, I'll try to move forward. I think the next steps are what we call transnationalism feminism, and that's feminism taking place all over the world and has been taking place. One can argue for thousands of years, but I think that now, because we're living in this new age of connectiveness in terms of the internet and social media, communication networks stronger than ever before, we're really seeing what women are doing around the world, and being able to come together collectively to work on issues. That includes, of course, the LGBTQIA and Two-Spirit communities, and their push for feminism. And that only really means equal rights for everyone. Really and truly, that's really what it boils down to. And then I will just briefly skip to the next slide, which is my last one. And if I had time, I would go into a really great case study about Uganda. But I think it's an awesome experience to look at what's happening in Uganda, what has happened in Uganda in terms of women gaining political power. And in Uganda, they have gender quotas. And at this point in time, 35% of the Ugandan parliament is women. And I could talk a lot more about that, but I will stop at this point. But it's been a really great, I think it's been a really great, interesting history. And this is really short, right? This is only 100 years. So I look forward to see what the next 100 years hold.
Thank you, Professor Pace. That was really interesting. I wish we had more time. We are rapidly running out of time, which I knew would happen, but that was really interesting. Thank you. Elizabeth Hodis, I'm going to go back to you because it is a political year. It's an election year, and I keep hearing about the women's vote and women's issues, and I'm wondering about your thoughts about whether that is even a thing anymore. Is that a fair premise for people to be talking about?
Is it a thing now, and was it ever a thing, right? I think that there is and always has been controversy around whether or how women as a collective group view certain types of issues. And I think there are a number of prominent examples where women, seriously disagree about issues that even in some cases they're perceived to have a consensus around. Historically, I think it's probably fair to say that there are certain issues that women have voted in groups on, but there are also a lot of issues, obviously, that they haven't. But a great example or a great person to talk about when you're thinking about that topic is a woman suffragist in Washington, Adela Parker, and she graduated from Washington's law school in 1903. And of course, you talked earlier about women in Washington winning and losing the vote three times over, which I'm sure was a disheartening experience there. But after securing the right to vote, Adela Parker actually went on to serve in Washington's legislature in 1935. And she's fascinating. I would encourage people to look her up, but I won't get into the details because I know we're running out of time, but she served on some interesting committees. And anyway, she was definitely not persuaded that there were such thing as women's issues. And she had a great quote that we pulled for this presentation. She said, "I've been looking for years to find any law that does not affect women, from a tariff on gloves to a declaration of war. The great problems which face the human race demand the genius of both men and women to solve. The law needs women quite as much as women need the law." And she said that at the National American Suffrage Convention in 1909. I just think it's a I think there are very few topics on which you could say all women agree. So, you know, I think she's absolutely right. And even as we've covered in the course of this presentation, women didn't even agree about how to gain suffrage, right? I mean, there was vast disagreement. And if you look at the different groups that were organized in order to pursue women's suffrage, you see some pretty harsh disagreement at times between women who felt very differently about whether or not there was sort of the more harsh approach, but sometimes those women were viewed as unsavory or improper or whatever. I mean, there are a lot of different ways, and I think Kimberly just went through a few examples of women who viewed the world differently and would perceive women's issues to be very different subjects, frankly.
We are rapidly running out of time, but there's one example I find so charming about women who are faced with this monumental task and needing to educate, and they had to start from somewhere. And I love the story about the cookbook and using that as a way to get started, both as to educate and to fundraise. I think we have time. If you want to just, could you quickly talk about that, Liz?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and we talked a little bit about women's clubs too, but the cookbooks are fascinating because, you know, there is sort of this idea that suffragists were looking for ways to organize, and not everyone was comfortable going to rallies or parades or being really vocal, and they had to be creative about finding ways to reach out to women in different forums and educate them about the topic of suffrage and helping them sort of spread the word and find ways to talk with people in their lives about it. And the cookbooks were not just a way to fundraise, but, you know, they were fundraisers, but they would allow, within the cookbooks, they would put little essays, little suffragist essays. They would put quotes. I found an example when I was doing my research where the chapter on pickles had a Susan B. Anthony quote about failure is impossible. And they had these, you know, really great little snippets of things that were both amusing and also educational. And they would insert them in these cookbooks. And then, of course, women could purchase the cookbooks without that, without the stigma of having to stand out and stand up and be a suffragist, right? I mean, they could educate themselves about those issues in a quiet, more peaceful way. And there was Emma DeVoe actually put it interestingly. She said that the cookbooks were a way for us to make us friends among men. So, you know, if we intersperse these suffragist ideas and essays and quotes among, you know, recipes for to cook at home for the people that we're supporting, you know, that the men in our lives that they will support us in turn, and they'll see that we're not just it's not one or the other. We can still cook for them and still have these ideas at the same time and value both of those things. So, and I think that also plays into the idea that that you see a lot of in the history of the Northwest, the still hunt strategy, the strategy of women, lobbying quietly at home their husbands and brothers and sons in a way that was sort of turning one person at a time. It's a slow, methodical way, but it's that kind of grassroots effort that ultimately has a big impact on what norms people are willing to accept. So. I continue to be, and I won't take up any more time, but I continue to just be fascinated by the ways that the concept of how people become informed about different issues and different topics and their access to information on those issues really impacts their ability to exercise their vote in a meaningful way. And when we talk about things like the Jim Crow laws and the variations of barriers that exist between people getting the right to vote and actually effectively using that right to vote, and the disenfranchisement that Elizabeth Hensley spoke about before, education and technology and access to information are all incredibly important ways that we are continuing to look to educate ourselves. Women educate themselves, people of color educate themselves, all immigrants educate themselves in a way that allows them to meaningfully use their vote. And you're right, cookbooks are a great example of a creative way that suffragists found to pursue the suffrage agenda.
Thanks, Liz. We need to do a program on the women's clubs and the cookbooks, and I love that. But of course, we are out of time. We're gonna. I wanted to get to Jane as our last speaker because she's going to talk about the League of Women Voters, and no program would be complete without talking about that and how they shaped and really helped some really important women in Alaska to get involved in politics. We're going to try to save time for a few questions.
So this is a very brief reflection. The League of Women Voters has been around for almost 100 years. And what they had done is create a process whereby women could get together to talk about public problems and what should we be doing about it. And in Alaska, we had league organizations in Juneau, in Anchorage, and Fairbanks, and now there's one in Kodiak and in the Kenai Peninsula. And it's women working to educate each other about the public process. And these are just some of the heroines of the League of Women Voters in Alaska. Arla Sturgeluski, who is a dear friend, I used to sit at her dining room table while we were working on projects. And she and Wilda Hudson and Wilda Marston and Carolyn Wolforth and Martha Roderick were sitting there conspiring how to change land use laws, how to change oil and gas structures that would work for families, or how to change public access to meetings. So I talked to Pat Redmond last night for 2 hours about all the studies. They would do a study, then they would take the study and give it to the government. And most of these women changed what was going on in the world, whether it was, and Arliss, of course, went on to the state legislature and served in the state Senate and ran for governor. And Heather, Martha, Carolyn, all served on the school board in an effort to make sure that they were going to create the kind of community we could hope for. Anyway, the League of Women Voters was the critical mass of the cabal of women who were thinking about stuff in the 60s and the 70s, long before we had internets and cell phones. And they would meet in the afternoon so they could get home in time to cook dinner. So, I mean, it's really grassroots glorious, and it still exists today. I know with great irony and joy is that Sherry Gross was the person who founded the Juneau Chamber of Commerce, and now one of her kids is turning out to be pretty darn good. So all I got to say is this is a vehicle that made women come together to take issue with the government. And sometimes they would just change it from the outside, and sometimes they would actually take over the government. So I also want to look at another group of people called the Alaska Women's Hall of Fame. And the Alaska Women's Hall of Fame was started on the 50th anniversary of the statehood. And what we have done is created a mechanism for honoring women from across the state. And these happen to be some of the 150 women who have been inducted into the Hall of Fame in the last 12 years. And they are the women who are minority women who were the first people of their people who got elected to public office, because they started out in little cabals and then they would go to a meeting and then here they are. And Georgiana Lincoln is the first Alaska Native woman in the state Senate. Blanche McSmith was the first African-American woman to serve in the Alaska House of Representatives. Betty Davis was the first and only Black woman who has served in the Alaska State Senate. And Thelma Buckholz was the first and only Filipino woman who has served in the Alaska House of Representatives. These women come from all different backgrounds. These women also are the only women who have been elected statewide in Alaska. Fran Elmer was the lieutenant governor. Sarah Palin was the governor. Lisa Murkowski is our existing U.S. senator. And what I'm saying about this is the Alaska Women's Hall of Fame have all of these women inducted, but they also have artists and aviation people and judges and all kinds of people. And the Alaska Women's Hall of Fame induction ceremony is next week on Tuesday, October 20th. You can go on to alaskawomenshalloffame.org and you can see the induction of the new class of 2020. So the Women's Hall of Fame tries to tell the story of women in all activities of life, and we encourage you to come on, look at the stories of these fabulous heroines.
Thank you, Jane. That was quick. and really interesting and inspiring. You've all inspired me. I so appreciate your participation, but I see we are about out of time. I think they're going to give us the hook, so we'll leave it at that.
Literally.
Thank you all. Oh, did you have a closing remark?
I'm sorry?
I thought someone was saying something. Oh, my apologies.
No, I'm saying we were hoping to save time for questions. I think we're out of time. If anyone has questions and wants to send them to me, I'm happy to answer them or forward to them to one of our panelists. But I think we're at 1:30. I think we're out of time. Thank you so much.
And thank you all very much for taking part in our webinar. And another very special thank you to Judge Kristen and all the panelists for their excellent and timely presentation, as well as Marilyn May, the Historians Committee, and Sonia Bilal with Judge Christian's office. Please be sure to complete your evaluation, which is in your member dashboard. And once you do, you'll receive your certificate of completion. I hope you all stay well and have a great weekend.